So usually when we try to diagnose a broken bone, there's this expectation of precision, you know?
Right, yeah.
Like you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor simply points and says, well, there it is. It's binary.
Broken or not broken.
Exactly. It's clean, and frankly, it's comforting. We like our problems to be visible, to be neatly categorized, and to have a straightforward mechanical fix.
But then you step into the world of human psychology.
Yeah, you step into deep societal trauma, and suddenly that x-ray machine is utterly useless. We find ourselves looking at a diagnostic landscape that is just murky, complex, and deeply subjective.
Absolutely.
And when you attempt to diagnose not just a single person, but an entire society, when you try to map out the exact mechanics of how a human mind shifts from total crushing despair to like explosive revolutionary fervor, you are deep in the muddy water.
Very deep.
So today, we are diving straight into those waters for you to map the architecture of a political and spiritual awakening. We're looking at two highly contrasting chapters of Upton Sinclair's 1906 novel, The Jungle. Specifically, we are unpacking chapters 29 and 31.
Yeah, and we are tracing a profound psychological and ideological journey today. I mean, we're going to examine the visceral, emotional radicalization of a completely broken man at a chaotic political rally.
And then follow that exact trajectory straight into a quiet, warm parlor, right?
Where intellectuals are literally mathematically plotting out a utopian future.
Yeah.
It's this wild journey from raw, screaming emotion to cold, calculated intellect.
It really is. Now, before we jump in, because we're dealing with heavily charged political content here regarding early 20th century capitalism and socialism, we need to establish our parameters for you.
Definitely.
Our mission today is strictly to act as guides. We are absolutely not taking a side, endorsing, or condemning these viewpoints.
No, not at all.
We're just strictly analyzing the rhetorical strategies, the philosophical arguments, and the vivid imagery exactly as the characters present them in the text.
We were just unpacking the mechanics of how these arguments are constructed, and how they affect the human psyche, entirely independent of the political viewpoints themselves.
Right. So we begin in chapter 29, and the physical and mental baseline of our main character, Jurgis, is just critical to everything that follows.
It's the foundation of the whole scene.
Yeah, we open on a scene where Jurgis is terrified, exhausted, and literally snoring at a political rally. He isn't there for the ideology.
No, he's just there because the room is heated.
Exactly, and he wakes up with this old, terrified start. He fixes his eyes straight ahead with painful intensity, fully expecting angry exclamations.
Is actively imagining a policeman striding toward him.
Reaching for his neck to throw him out into the freezing cold. He's sitting there trembling, just bracing his body for a physical blow.
His entire existence at this point is defined by anticipating violence. I mean, he occupies the absolute lowest rung of the social hierarchy.
Yeah.
And his nervous system is conditioned to expect punishment simply for taking up space, for seeking warmth, for experiencing biological exhaustion.
It's heartbreaking.
The text paints a picture of a man who has totally internalized his own degradation. The expectation of the policeman's hand on his neck isn't just a fear for him. It's his accepted reality.
And into that tense, bracing silence, a voice comes into his ear. It's a woman's voice, and it's described as gentle and sweet. She says, if you would try to listen, comrade, perhaps you would be interested.
Wow.
Right. And Sinclair notes that Jurgis is more startled by that gentle tone than he would have been by the physical strike of a policeman's club.
Because it's so out of his reality.
He doesn't even move at first. His heart gives a massive leap, but he keeps his eyes fixed dead ahead. He actually waits until he's absolutely sure he isn't being watched before he steals a glance at her.
And what does he see?
He sees she's young, beautiful, wearing fine clothes. She's what the text calls a lady, and she just called him a filthy, snoring man off the street comrade.
That single word, comrade, it acts as an absolute disruption of his reality. It shatters the rigid class hierarchy he's accepted as a law of nature.
Yeah.
But notice the sensory overload Sinclair builds into this moment. Jurgis is so entirely shocked by the interaction, by the proximity of this wealthy woman treating him as an equal, that he doesn't even register the words of the speaker on the platform.
Not a single word.
Right. His attention is entirely captivated by the woman sitting next to him, and specifically by her physical reaction to the speech.
He watches her face, and a feeling of genuine alarm steals over him. Sinclair actually writes that it makes his flesh creep.
Which is such a visceral description.
Because this wealthy, refined woman is reacting to the speaker on the platform with an intensity that borders on frightening. She's sitting as if turned to stone, but her hands are clenched so tightly in her lap that Jurgis can literally see the cords standing out in her wrists. There's a faint, rapid quivering of her nostrils. She's moistening her lips with feverish haste. Her breathing is rising and falling like a boat tossing upon ocean surges. I mean, she looks like she's either witnessing a brutal physical struggle or struggling mightily herself.
She is experiencing a vicarious agony. The physical description, the clenched hands, the visible veins, the erratic breathing, it translates ideological passion into an undeniable biological reality.
Right.
Jurgis is sitting there completely baffled, thinking, what could possibly be going on to affect anyone like that? It's only through observing her intense physical distress that it even occurs to him to look up and see what she's looking at.
And when he finally directs his gaze to the platform, the visual of the speaker entirely matches the woman's physical reaction.
The visual is intense.
Sinclair describes the experience of looking at this man as coming suddenly upon some wild sight of nature, like a mountain forest lashed by a tempest, or a ship tossed about upon a stormy sea.
Yeah, the orator is tall, gaunt, and haggard. Like just as haggard and starved as Jurgis himself.
He has a thin, black beard, and in the harsh light, you can only see two black hollows where his eyes should be. He's moving wildly, reaching out with long, sweeping arms as if trying to physically seize the audience and drag them toward him.
And the acoustic details amplify that visual, His voice is described as being deep, resonating like an organ. It's trembling, vibrant, with an overwhelming emotion heavy with pain and longing.
Let's pause on the mechanics of this awakening for a second, because Jurgis's expectation of violence, he's essentially cowering like a stray dog bracing for a kick, right?
That's exactly it.
When that gentle word comrade arrives instead, the contrast creates a seismic psychological shock. But the sequence of events is crucial here. Jurgis doesn't hear a logical argument and decide to change his political affiliation.
No, not at all.
So is the text actually showing us that radicalization often begins purely through the infectious physical spectacle of seeing someone else deeply moved? Like it's a visual contagion before it's an intellectual realization.
I agree completely. And the pacing of the scene supports that interpretation perfectly. Sinclair deliberately delays the transmission of the actual political arguments.
He really does.
The narrative explicitly points out that it was quite some time before Jurgis even thought to process the speaker's words, because his visual processing was so overwhelmed.
He's watching the cords in the woman's wrists.
Right, and he's watching the frantic sweeping of the speaker's arms. He is gripped by the emotional disruption and the sheer raw pain vibrating in the speaker's voice, rather than the vocabulary being used.
Yeah, the feeling comes first.
Exactly. This highlights a foundational theme in the text. Political awakenings, especially for those experiencing extreme oppression, are deeply emotional and profoundly physical long before they are intellectual.
The intellect arrives later to build a framework around the feeling.
Right, but the initial hook is raw human empathy and the shock of shared suffering.
Okay, so having been hooked by that physical spectacle, Jurgis finally tunes into the actual content of the speech. The speaker's voice seems to narrow its focus, pointing straight at Jurgis, gripping him and transfixing him.
And this plunges us directly into the rhetoric of oppression.
Right. The orator launches into a blistering, relentless indictment of the daily grind the workers endure.
He opens by attacking the ingrained fatalism of the working class. He actively mocks the passive attitude of workers who acknowledge their misery but dismiss it by saying, yes, these things are true, but they have been that way always, or maybe relief will come, but not in my time. It will not help me.
He's trying to shatter the normalization of their suffering.
Exactly. He strips away any illusion that their labor has dignity under the current system.
He tells them bluntly that they go back every single day to be ground up for profits in the worldwide mill of economic might.
Such a powerful phrase.
He lists the brutal realities, toiling long, agonizing hours solely for another man's advantage, living in squalid, disease-ridden homes, working in incredibly dangerous environments, constantly wrestling with hunger.
And taking daily chances of accident, disease, and premature death. He makes sure they recognize that every passing day, the struggle is becoming fiercer, and the pace of the machinery is becoming more cruel.
Yeah, he describes this escalating pressure as the iron hand of circumstance, closing upon them a little tighter with each passing hour.
And following this grim assessment, The speaker makes a solemn vow of relentless, inescapable agitation.
He really commits.
He declares that there is no wilderness isolated enough for him to hide in, no haven remote enough for him to escape to, because wherever he goes, he finds the same accursed economic system everywhere. A system where all the fair and noble impulses of humanity are systematically shackled and harnessed in the service of organized, predatory greed.
He makes it a moral imperative that he simply cannot remain silent. He dramatically casts aside comfort, health, and good repute. He tells the crowd he won't be silenced by the threat of poverty, the onset of sickness, the sting of ridicule, or the walls of a prison.
Right, because he believes with absolute certainty that if the true vision of his soul were spoken aloud, it possesses enough inherent power to shake the most sluggish, beaten-down soul into immediate action.
Which brings us to the core of his rhetorical authority. He doesn't claim to speak as an outside observer, right? Or a sympathetic academic.
No, he claims to speak with the actual voice of the millions who have been rendered completely voiceless by the system.
And the specific examples he uses to embody this voicelessness are hauntingly cinematic. Like, he creates a rapid-fire, intensely visual montage of misery that just sweeps across demographics and geography.
It's very vivid.
He says he speaks with the voice of the little child who is toiling tonight in a southern cotton mill, staggering under the weight of sheer exhaustion. He speaks for the mother sewing by candlelight in her freezing tenement garret, her heart smitten with the hunger of her babies.
And he channels the man lying upon a filthy bed of rags, wrestling in the final agonies of his last sickness.
And he invokes the young girl in Chicago who is beaten and starving, forced into an impossible, horrifying choice between the brothel and the lake.
The lake meaning suicide by drowning in Lake Michigan.
God, it's just an uncompromising, brutal panorama of despair. He characterizes all these disparate individuals as being equally caught and crushed beneath the wheels of the juggernaut of greed.
That specific word choice, juggernaut, is fascinating if we look at the etymology.
A juggernaut originally referred to a massive, unstoppable wagon bearing a Hindu deity, which, according to European accounts, devotees would throw themselves under to be crushed as a religious sacrifice.
So the speaker is essentially framing capitalism, not just as an economic engine, but as a false, bloodthirsty religion that demands constant human sacrifice to keep moving forward.
But looking at the structure of this scene, a major paradox emerges here for me. The speaker claims to be the authentic voice of the uncultured, the disinherited, and the illiterate.
Right.
Yet he's clearly a masterful, highly articulate orator. He's deploying elevated vocabulary, sophisticated sentence structures, and incredibly potent poetic metaphors. Does the text reconcile how this eloquent, almost Shakespearean figure can authentically claim to be the voice of people who literally do not possess the language to speak for themselves?
That is a great point. Sinclair is highly aware of that tension, and he addresses it head-on when the speaker subsequently reveals his own personal history to the crowd.
Oh, right, the backstory.
Yeah, he does not validate his authority by citing university degrees or political pedigree. He validates his eloquence through the crucible of shared visceral trauma. He tells the crowd, "I know how much it is to ask of you. I know, for I have been in your place. I have lived your life."
He strips away any perception of privilege, revealing that he was a street waif, a bootblack who survived upon discarded crusts of bread and slept huddled in cellar stairways and underneath empty wagons in the freezing streets.
He tells them he personally watched the fair flowers of his own spirit get trampled into the mire by the wild beast powers of his environment.
So he explains exactly how he acquired his elevated language and understanding.
Right. He paid for his knowledge with agony of body and mind. He bought it with his physical health and nearly with his life itself.
He stole the hours required for study away from his own sleep.
And funded his education with his own hunger. Therefore, within the internal logic of the novel, his extreme articulateness is not framed as a marker of elite status. It is presented as a weapon forged in the searing heat of first-hand suffering.
That is so powerful.
His eloquence is a hard-won victory over a system that was specifically designed to keep him ignorant and silent.
That framing completely changes his relationship with the audience. He transitions from being just a sympathetic lecturer to serving as an actual breathing avatar of the crowd's own suppressed potential.
Exactly. Which sets the stage perfectly for his pivot from describing the misery of the masses to analyzing the machinery of the elite.
Right. We are moving into the contrast between the juggernaut of greed and the staggering price of luxury.
The speaker executes a massive shift in scale here, having established the granular, individual suffering of the child in the mill and the girl by the lake, he zooms out to paint a picture of a systemic, world-devouring machine.
He uses both global events and local statistics to illustrate the incomprehensible wealth and power of the ruling class. Globally, he points the audience's attention toward the plains of Manchuria, referencing the incredibly bloody Russo-Japanese War happening at that exact time.
He describes two massive hostile armies facing each other, a million human beings striving with the absolute fury of maniacs to tear each other to pieces.
And he underscores the bitter, tragic irony that this wholesale slaughter is taking place 1900 years after the birth of the Prince of Peace.
He builds an argument that modern society has taken all its greatest advancements, its schools, its colleges, the marvels of science, the reach of newspapers, and deployed them merely to equip men to destroy each other more efficiently.
He doesn't shy away from the gore either. He graphically describes human bodies pierced by bullets, the sickening crunch of a bayonet driving into human flesh, and the blood that's still visibly steaming in the cold air.
It's horrifying. And his deepest condemnation is reserved for the institutions, the newspapers, and the churches that know this is happening, that pass it by daily, and yet fail to rise up and spark a revolution to stop it.
After painting that terrifying global portrait, he aggressively snaps the focus back to the local level. He says to the crowd, "Perhaps Manchuria is too far away for you. Come home with me then. Come here to Chicago."
And the demographic statistics he throws out are staggering in their scale. He cites 10,000 women driven to prostitution just to survive, 10,000 homeless men begging merely for a chance to perform grueling labor,
100,000 children having their lives blasted and stunted just to earn basic bread,
100,000 mothers drowning in perpetual misery, 100,000 helpless old people waiting in terror for death, and 1 million people sharing the relentless, grinding curse of the wage slave.
He distills the existence of 1 million human beings down to a terrifying monotony, right? Weariness, hunger, dirt, disease, and total ignorance.
Yeah. And having established the unimaginable weight of that suffering, he forcefully commands the audience to turn over the page and confront the other side of the equation.
He forces them to look at the masters. He estimates there are 1,000, perhaps 10,000 at most, who sit as the absolute masters of these million slaves.
And the defining characteristic he assigns to them is that they do absolutely nothing to earn the vast wealth they receive.
Nothing at all.
They perform no labor. They don't even have to actively ask for the wealth. It simply automatically flows to them.
He describes them living in palatial estates, rioting in a level of luxury that makes the human imagination real. Sinclair lists the specific absurdities of their luxury to drive the point home.
Like what?
He talks about hundreds of dollars being spent for a single pair of shoes or a fine handkerchief or a decorative garter. He details the millions of dollars poured into breeding horses, purchasing automobiles, building massive yachts, hosting opulent banquets, and acquiring little shiny stones simply to deck their bodies.
Just unbelievable waste.
He frames their entire existence as a grotesque contest in ostentation and recklessness, a lifestyle built entirely upon the foundation of wasting the labor and the actual lives of their fellow human beings. He dehumanizes them in return, calling them fierce wolves and ravening vultures.
The most compelling part of this rhetorical pivot is how the speaker describes the mechanism of this wealth transfer. He doesn't describe it as a series of individual business decisions. He describes it as a phenomenon almost governed by the laws of physics.
It's framed like a law of geographical inevitability. The speaker compares the upward flow of wealth to the natural movement of water.
Right, like rivers.
Yeah. Just as springs inevitably pour into streamlets, and streamlets gather into rivers, and rivers inevitably empty into the oceans, so, automatically, relentlessly, and inevitably, all the wealth produced by society flows to these masters.
The farmer working the field, the miner deep in the earth, the weaver at the loom, the inventor in the lab. Every ounce of value they generate is gathered into one stupendous, unstoppable stream that is poured directly into the laps of the idle elite.
He expands on the sheer omnipotence of this system by declaring that the masters own not merely the physical labor of society, but they have actively purchased the governments themselves.
Yes. They utilize this raped and stolen power to legally entrench their positions and dredge even wider, deeper channels to accelerate the river of profits flowing toward them.
But if we look closely at the argument being built here, it seems to present a massive logical problem. Well, the speaker paints the capitalist system as utterly invincible. It owns the labor, It bought the government. It controls the flow of wealth with the same inevitable force that gravity controls water.
Right.
If the enemy is truly this omnipotent, how can the speaker possibly expect a room full of broken, exhausted, freezing wage slaves to fight it? Doesn't detailing the absolute supremacy of the system risk driving the audience deeper into the very fatalism he's trying to cure?
That is the brilliant, counterintuitive nature of his rhetorical strategy. He uses the sheer, overwhelming, apocalyptic scale of the horror to argue the exact opposite of despair.
Interesting.
He is asserting that such a monstrous, top-heavy system simply cannot mathematically, logically, or morally sustain itself indefinitely.
So explain the mechanics of that pivot for us. How does he turn omnipotence into vulnerability?
He challenges the audience's underlying assumptions directly. He asks the room, is there a man among you who can believe that such a system will continue forever, that the product of the labor of society will always belong to idlers and parasites? His strategy relies on extreme contrast. When a system is presented as only marginally unfair, human beings possess a remarkable capacity to adapt, to put their heads down and just survive.
Sure, you just push through.
But when the system is presented as a grotesque, apocalyptic absurdity, where 1 million people starve so that 10,000 people can buy diamond-studded garters, it shatters the illusion of normalcy.
The scale of the inequality proves its inherent instability.
Exactly. It shocks the sluggish soul into realizing that this isn't a law of nature. It is a highly fragile, artificial construct that must inevitably collapse under its own moral weight.
So the argument is that a structure leaning that far over is guaranteed to fall, and the workers just need to realize they have the power to push it.
Which propels us directly into the climax of the speech and the explosive psychological transformation of Jurgis.
The speaker accelerates toward his conclusion by posing a critical question to the crowd. Where will their deliverance actually come from? And he systematically eliminates any hope of rescue from above.
Right. He asks if they expect the masters to suddenly grow a conscience and write the charter of their liberties.
Will the wealthy elite forge the sort of deliverance for the working class? Will the ruling class build colleges to educate them or organize political parties to guide their struggle for freedom?
And the answer, echoing through the hall, is a resounding absolute no. The task of liberation belongs exclusively to the workers themselves.
He insists that deliverance must be won, as he phrases it, in the face of every obstacle that wealth and mastership can oppose. It must be won by the raw, physical power of their naked bosoms, opposed to the rage of oppression.
He tells them freedom will be bought by agony and sweat of blood, by money paid for with intense hunger, by knowledge stolen from the hours of sleep.
And to crystallize this immense undertaking, he deploys an incredible personification of labor itself. He describes labor as a mighty giant, lying prostrate, mountainous, colossal, but blinded, bound, and ignorant of his own strength.
And this sleeping, bound giant is haunted by a persistent dream of resistance. Suddenly, he stirs. A single fetter snaps. A thrill of realization shoots through his massive, mountainous body. The dream translates into physical action, and the giant springs to his feet, towering and gigantic, shouting in the exultation of his newborn consciousness.
Right at the peak of this imagery, the speaker's voice literally breaks under the immense stress of his own feelings. He stands there on the platform with his long arms stretched out toward the crowd, and the audience simply explodes.
The tension shatters.
They surge to their feet with a collective yell, waving their arms in the air, laughing aloud in a state of pure, unadulterated excitement. And amidst this chaos, Jurgis is standing up, shouting with enough force to literally tear his own throat.
The physical description of Jurgis' reaction is both terrifying and profoundly beautiful. He is shouting involuntarily. His body is taken over.
The narrative explicitly clarifies that it wasn't just the logic of the words that triggered this, right?
Right. It was the strange, vibrating intonations of the speaker's voice that rang through the deepest chambers of Jurgis' soul, echoing like the clanging of a bell.
The text describes the experience as being gripped by a mighty, invisible hand, shaking him with a sudden, overwhelming fright. He feels an unfolding of vast vistas before him, a literal breaking of the solid ground beneath his feet.
He feels dark, demon forces violently contending inside his own chest. The speaker's sentences were crashing over him like thunder.
And in that moment of shattered reality, all of his old hopes, his buried longings, his suppressed griefs, his smothered rages, and his deepest despairs come flooding back to the surface simultaneously.
I mean, think about the psychological mechanics of what is happening to Jurgis here. He is a man who has been brutally beaten down, repeatedly traumatized, and literally left freezing and starving on the streets.
Just to survive that level of daily horror, you have to repress your humanity. You have to numb yourself just to endure the next 10 minutes.
Exactly. He has been existing deep underwater, normalizing the crushing pressure of the ocean just to keep his lungs functioning. What the orator does isn't just give him a breath of air. He grabs Jurgis and pulls him to the surface so incredibly fast that Jurgis effectively gets the psychological bends.
Wow, yeah. It's a violent, agonizing depressurization. Jurgis realizes, in a flash of terror, that he had actually submitted to his own degradation. Sinclair writes that it was a thing of terror and madness that Jurgis had made terms with his own despair.
And this realization prompts Sinclair to pose one of the most profound philosophical questions in the entire novel. What is the murder of them that kill the body to the murder of them that kill the soul?
Jurgis realizes with absolute clarity that his soul had been systematically murdered by the system, and he had passively allowed it to happen. And now, the false pillars of his deadened soul are collapsing inward. The sky above him is splitting open.
He stands amidst the cheering crowd with his hands clenched into fists, his eyes bloodshot, the purple veins standing out thick on his face, roaring in the guttural voice of a wild beast.
And when his vocal cords finally give out and he cannot shout another sound, he simply whispers over and over, "By God, by God, by God."
It is a total, irreversible system override. The old Jurgis is gone.
The vocabulary Sinclair uses here is fascinating, right? Visions, thunder, demons, awe, terror, soul murder.
Yeah, it's very intense.
The text strongly suggests that when dealing with this specific level of systemic oppression, when a human being has been deliberately reduced to the status of a beast of burden, a pamphlet filled with economic statistics is completely useless.
Holy.
Mere logic cannot undo the murder of a soul. The text frames this political awakening not as a shift in voting preference, but as an almost supernatural, deeply religious shock to the nervous system. It requires an agonizing spiritual resurrection to restart a stopped heart.
That framing is essential for understanding the dual nature of radicalization Sinclair is exploring. The movement absolutely requires the fiery orator to break the chains of despair and awaken the raw, beating heart of the worker.
The emotional conversion must happen first.
Right. Which is precisely why the immediate transition into the next chapter is so masterfully jarring. Having witnessed the resurrection of the heart, the novel immediately forces us to examine the architecture of the mind.
The whiplash is intense. We move from the chaotic, sweating, screaming, emotionally explosive streets of Chapter 29 directly into the quiet, controlled, intellectual environment of Chapter 31.
It's like stepping into a different world.
We leave the storm and enter a quiet parlor with a warm fire crackling on the hearth, and we're introduced to a completely new ideological archetype, Dr. Nicholas Schliemann.
Dr. Schliemann is a Swedish ex-professor of philosophy, and he operates as the absolute polar opposite of the fiery speaker we just left. Where the orator was a tempest of emotion, pain, and sweeping gestures, Schliemann's delivery is incredibly controlled.
The narrative notes that he speaks simply and utterly without emotion, with the manner of a teacher setting forth to a group of scholars an axiom in geometry.
Schliemann identifies himself as a philosophic anarchist. He voluntarily walked away from a prestigious university position because he felt the institution required him to sell his moral character alongside his time.
And the personal lifestyle he's adopted in response is a fascinating, extreme form of rebellion.
He operates from a place of absolute asceticism. He lives in a tiny garret room in a slum, surviving on exactly 11 cents a day.
11 cents.
He approaches his own biology like a math problem. He has studied the exact chemical composition of foodstuffs, calculating precisely how many proteins and carbohydrates his body requires to function, and consuming not an ounce more.
He even claims that by utilizing a method of scientific chewing, he manages to triple the nutritional value of everything he eats, which, I mean...
It's very intense.
Yeah, he has minimized his footprint in the capitalist system to the absolute bare minimum required to maintain a pulse. He works in the harvest fields for a brief stint during the summer, just long enough to earn $125, and that small sum funds his entire existence for the rest of the year.
And he adamantly refuses to marry, stating with cold logic that no sane man would ever allow himself to fall in love or take on dependence until after the revolution has successfully dismantled the current economic order.
It is a total rejection of societal expectations. When analyzing Schliemann's lifestyle, there's an incredibly strong modern parallel. He resembles a modern-day extreme biohacker combined with a hardcore adherent of the FIRE movement, financial independence, retire early.
Oh, absolutely.
We see these modern movements where people live in tiny homes, consume nothing but rice and beans, and optimize every penny so they can escape the corporate grind by age 30. But the crucial difference is motivation. Modern FIRE adherents are usually driven by a desire to build personal wealth and secure private leisure.
Right. Whereas Schliemann is driven entirely by anti-capitalist zeal. He isn't trying to build a stock portfolio. He's trying to starve the capitalist beast by deliberately withholding his participation as a consumer and a laborer.
He has effectively optimized his own biology to resist the macroeconomy. And he applies that exact same cold, optimizing, ruthless logic when analyzing human institutions. The text notes that he understands the foundations of human institutions so thoroughly that he blows them about like soap bubbles.
He delivers propositions in this quiet parlor that would make the hair of an ordinary person stand on end. He casually asserts that the sole exclusive purpose of government is the guarding of property rights and the perpetuation of modern economic fraud.
And his deconstruction of marriage is equally clinical and aggressively destructive to traditional societal norms. He argues, without a trace of sentimentality, that marriage and prostitution are the exact same institution. They're simply two sides of the same economic shield.
He defines both exclusively as the predatory man's exploitation of sex pleasure.
He argues that the only distinguishing factor between a wife and a prostitute is a difference of class and leverage. If a woman possesses money or social standing, she has the leverage to dictate the terms of her exploitation. She demands equality, a binding life contract, and legal property rights for her future children. Society calls that marriage.
But if a woman has no money and no leverage, she's a proletarian, and she is forced to sell herself piecemeal simply to secure the calories needed to exist. Society calls that prostitution.
He brutally reduces the most intimate human relationships down to raw property and power dynamics.
He views every interaction through the lens of economic transactions.
But this brings up a massive question regarding the effectiveness of his communication style. Schliemann delivers these world-shattering, highly offensive, deeply controversial ideas, completely devoid of emotion, like a geometry teacher outlining a proof.
Right.
We just spent a chapter watching Jurgis undergo an intensely violent, weeping, roaring emotional awakening. Wouldn't Schliemann's cold, mathematical, almost alien approach completely alienate the very traumatized workers he wants to liberate?
That is the exact flaw many critics point out when analyzing utopian intellectuals. They assume people operate like calculators rather than emotional beings. But Sinclair anticipates this critique, and the text offers a surprising counterpoint.
Yeah.
You would logically assume Jurgis would be repelled by this icy detachment, but the narrative explicitly states that Jurgis feels a subtle bond forming between himself and Schliemann.
The text actually says Jurgis manages to follow Schliemann's dense, abstract arguments, riding them like a very Mazeppa ride upon the wild horse speculation.
Which perfectly illustrates how Sinclair envisions the architecture of a movement. The movement fundamentally requires the fiery orator to break the chains of despair and awaken the heart. But once the worker is awake, the mind desperately needs structure.
He needs a blueprint.
Exactly. It needs a blueprint to understand the mechanics of the cage it was just freed from.
Yeah.
Schliemann provides that cold intellect. He provides the architectural blueprints of their oppression. Jurgis is able to be carried over the difficult, abstract places of Schliemann's argument, specifically because he has already made the massive emotional leap.
The heart provides the fuel, but the intellect builds the engine to harness it.
Yes.
But building this new system isn't just about math and agriculture. It requires addressing the fundamental moral and spiritual pillars of society, which immediately triggers a massive collision in this quiet parlor. We move into what is essentially a theological brawl between Christian socialism and atheism.
Schliemann's destructive logic doesn't stop at government and marriage. He directs his analytical weaponry straight at religion, aggressively labeling it the archfiend's deadliest weapon.
He constructs a dual theory of oppression. He argues that while the government oppresses the physical body of the wage slave through police and laws, religion is the tool designed to oppress the mind.
He accuses religion of deliberately poisoning the stream of human progress at its very source by teaching the working man to fix all his hopes on an imaginary future life.
Ensuring he remains passive while his pockets are actively picked in this one. He argues that religion instills frugality, humility, and obedience traits he dismisses as the pseudo-virtues of capitalism.
He goes so far as to predict that the ultimate destiny of human civilization will be decided in a final apocalyptic death struggle between the forces of socialism and the Roman Catholic Church.
And this aggressive stance is where another character in the parlor, Comrade Lucas, violently enters the fray. Lucas is an ex-preacher. He isn't highly educated in abstract philosophy like Schliemann, but he possesses a deep, formidable knowledge of the Bible, interpreted through the lens of real, grinding poverty and experience.
And he fiercely defends religion. Or, more accurately, he fiercely separates the deep corruption of the modern institutional church from the original radical teachings of Jesus.
Lucas challenges Schliemann directly, asking what possible use there is in confusing the true essence of religion with the corrupt perversions created by greedy men. He wields the Bible as a weapon of class warfare.
He uses the Book of Job as a direct attack on the monopolistic practices of the beef trust. He points to the fiery condemnations of Isaiah, and most importantly, he points to the Master himself.
Lucas paints a radically different, highly political picture of Jesus. He strips away the soft, glowing imagery. He says Jesus wasn't some elegant prince of debauched art, nor was he the jeweled, passive idol worshipped in high society churches.
Lucas aggressively reclaims Jesus as the world's very first working-class revolutionist, the true historical founder of the socialist movement.
He describes the historical Jesus as a man whose entire being was consumed by one massive flame of hatred for hoarded wealth. He describes him as a beggar, a tramp, a marginalized man of the people who deliberately associated with saloon keepers, outcasts, and prostitutes.
Lucas rapidly fires off scriptural quotes to build his case. "Lay not up for yourselves treasures on earth. Woe unto you that are rich."
He forcefully reminds the room that Jesus didn't write polite letters to the businessmen and brokers in the temple. He braided a whip and physically drove them out. And Lucas argues that Jesus was ultimately crucified specifically for being a political incendiary and a dangerous disturber of the established social order.
And Lucas expresses absolute visceral horror at what the modern institutional church has done with this revolutionary figure. He accuses them of domesticating Jesus, turning him into the high priest of property and smug respectability.
He points out the grotesque hypocrisy that modern pirates of industry bring their stolen dollars money wrung directly from the agonizing toil of helpless women and children to build opulent stone temples in his name.
Lucas becomes incredibly passionate, almost matching the orator from the rally. He poses a hypothetical to the room. If Jesus were to return to Earth tonight and witness the plains of Manchuria, where men march out to commit wholesale mechanized murder with a jeweled image of him carried before them, wouldn't he go completely mad?
He declares that if Jesus were walking the streets of St. Petersburg right now, he would immediately take up the whip against the bankers and the oligarchs.
And this soaring, passionate defense is abruptly punctured when Schliemann interrupts with a darkly comedic but incredibly violent quip.
Oh man, Schliemann listens to this impassioned speech about Jesus returning with a whip, and he dryly replies, "No, comrade, for he was a practical man. He would take pretty little imitation lemons, such as are now being shipped into Russia, handy for carrying in the pockets, and strong enough to blow a whole temple out of sight."
He's referring to explosives, he's referring to bombs.
Schliemann effortlessly equates a modern, practical Jesus with a bomb-throwing, temple-destroying anarchist. It is a wild, incredibly tense exchange.
It really is.
Lucas is desperately trying to reclaim the moral and historical authority of Jesus to rouse the workers, while Schliemann clearly just wants to pack the entire religious institution with explosives and blow it out of existence. How does the text reconcile these completely opposite worldviews? I mean, these two men are sitting in the exact same room, supposedly fighting on the same side of the revolution, yet their fundamental philosophies regarding the human soul are at war.
Sinclair uses this friction to illustrate the messy reality of building political coalitions. The text doesn't hide the tension, it embraces it. A third character named Mr. Maynard, the editor of a socialist newspaper, explicitly steps in here to mediate.
Right.
He effectively acts as the voice of the confused reader. Maynard states, somewhat naively, that he always assumed socialists had a rigid, cut-and-dried program, but here he is, watching two active, dedicated members who seem to agree about absolutely nothing at all.
Maynard's intervention forces Schliemann and Lucas to strip away their philosophical differences and identify their absolute baseline common ground. Which brings us to defining the actual vision of this movement. Maynard's prompt forces them to establish what socialism, in this context, actually requires.
After considerable debate, they agree upon two carefully worded foundational propositions. Proposition 1. The common ownership and the democratic management of the means of producing the basic necessities of life.
Okay.
Proposition 2. The specific means by which this massive transfer of ownership is to be brought about is the class-conscious political organization of the wage earners.
That is the exact limit of their agreement. Beyond those two structural points, their visions for the future diverge wildly. For Lucas, the religious zealot, the ultimate goal of the revolution is the establishment of the New Jerusalem, the literal kingdom of heaven manifested on earth.
For Schliemann, the philosophic anarchist, the goal has nothing to do with heaven. It is entirely about securing the unrestricted, free development of every individual human personality.
And Schliemann lays out a very specific formula to achieve this. Communism in material production, anarchism in intellectual.
This is perhaps the most vital distinction in Schliemann's entire philosophy. He builds this theory on a simple observation regarding scarcity. He argues that material things, the arable earth, the yield of wheat, the veins of coal, are inherently limited.
Because they're physical things.
Right. Because they are limited, and because everyone requires them to survive, it is both feasible and morally necessary to submit the management of these material industries to the democratic control of a majority vote.
The logic being, the same match lights everyone's fire, the same loaf of bread fills everyone's stomach, regardless of their philosophical beliefs.
Precisely. The biological needs are universal, and the resources are finite. But, Schliemann argues, intellectual and moral pursuits are completely limitless. One person possessing a vast amount of knowledge or creating a massive amount of art does not in any way deplete the amount of knowledge or art available for someone else to generate.
That makes a lot of sense.
Therefore, while material production must be managed communally to ensure survival, intellectual and artistic pursuits must remain in a state of complete, unrestricted anarchism.
He describes an intricate post-revolution vision where, once the basic material needs are secured by a fraction of daily labor, society naturally breaks up into thousands of independent, self-governing communities of mutually congenial persons. He calls them free associations.
And the examples he gives sound remarkably prescient.
They really do. He imagines romantic novelists being supported voluntarily by this specific group of people who enjoy reading romantic novels. Impressionist painters supported directly by those who appreciate their specific style of painting. Preachers, scientists, musicians, philosophers, all sustained not by a corporate wage or a government grant, but by the voluntary association and funding of their dedicated audience.
And he adds a crucial safety net. If you want to dedicate your life to a highly niche, avant-garde form of art, and you cannot find a single person willing to voluntarily maintain you, you are not condemned to starve.
You simply support yourself by working in the communal material production for a tiny fraction of the day. Because, he claims, once capitalist exploitation and massive systemic waste are eliminated, any human being would be able to easily support their basic survival needs with merely 1 hour of work a day. I have to draw a strong modern parallel here because Schliemann's vision is essentially predicting the modern creator economy. His idea of voluntarily funding artists and thinkers based on highly niche interests sounds exactly like modern crowdfunding platforms.
Oh, totally.
It's the exact philosophical blueprint for Patreon, for Substack, for Kickstarter. The idea that a creator bypasses the massive corporate publishers or galleries, and instead, a small, dedicated community voluntarily pools their resources to sustain that creator's specific intellectual or artistic output.
It is an incredibly apt comparison. The platforms you mentioned are essentially functioning models of the intellectual anarchism he is describing, operating within the boundaries of a digital space.
But looking at the broader scope of his utopian vision, I have a major pushback. Schliemann is assuming that if you remove the threat of starvation, and people only have to work 1 hour a day to survive, they will naturally use their remaining time to form happy, mutually congenial clubs, pursue high art, read deep philosophy, and fund impressionist painters.
Right, the utopian ideal.
Doesn't the text completely gloss over the darker realities of human nature here? Is he being overly naive about what human beings actually do with unlimited free time? Because if you look at the modern world, we have vastly more free time and technological ease compared to the workers of 1906. And a significant portion of that time goes directly into doom scrolling, consuming junk entertainment, and engaging in petty online conflicts, not sitting under a tree reading good.
That is the classic counterargument to almost all utopian literature. But Schliemann and Sinclair, through him, would argue that your definition of human nature is entirely corrupted by the environment you are observing it in.
Okay, how so?
Schlieman's foundational premise is that current human nature is grotesquely deformed by the constant, grinding nightmare of competition. The text argues that the behaviors we casually dismiss as naturally lazy, vicious, frivolous, or greedy are not inherent human traits. They are actually symptoms of deep psychological exhaustion and systemic trauma caused by wage slavery.
So his argument is that we are observing animals in a hyper-stressful zoo and mistaking their pacing and aggression for their natural behavior in the wild.
Exactly. He believes that once the constant existential terror of biological survival is permanently removed from the human psyche, human desires, capacities, and behaviors will fundamentally evolve. He argues we don't even know what actual uncorrupted human nature looks like yet.
So if Schleiman believes people only truly need to work one single hour a day to generate enough material wealth to survive, he has to account for the other 9 to 11 hours of grueling labor currently happening in 1906. Where does he think all that excess human effort is actually going? He argues it is being entirely swallowed and destroyed by the massive structural friction of capitalism itself. And this leads into his sweeping economic critique, which he categorizes as the wastes of competition.
The editor character, Maynard, asks this exact question. How can a massive, complex society possibly exist on merely 1 hour of toil per person? And Schliemann unleashes a blistering mathematical critique of capitalism's inherent inefficiencies.
He establishes his baseline argument by stating that in the current competitive system, the hoarding of money is the only recognized test of prowess, and therefore conspicuous wastefulness becomes the sole criterion of social power.
He begins by identifying the massive negative wastes. He points first to the institution of war. He argues that the true cost of war isn't merely the tragic loss of lives and the physical materials destroyed in combat, nor is it just the millions of able-bodied men kept in perpetual idleness during peacetime just to parade in uniforms. The true hidden cost is the massive drain on the vital energies of society, the institutionalized ignorance, and the subsequent crime it inevitably entails. He estimates mathematically that 2 full hours of the working time of every single efficient member of society is siphoned off solely to feed the red fiend of war.
Then he breaks down the structural inefficiencies of the rest of the workforce. He calculates that a full 30% of the population is occupied entirely in producing useless, frivolous articles designed solely for ostentation, and another 1% is occupied specifically in destroying them.
And he categorizes the vast armies of servants, footmen, and menials attending to the rich as economic parasites, consuming resources without producing value.
And he traces how this disease of competitive display penetrates and corrupts the entire social body, top to bottom. He describes 1 million middle-class women who are chronically miserable because they aren't part of the elite, spending all their time and resources trying desperately to appear as if they are.
He points to 5 million farmers' wives whose minds are consumed by reading fashion papers, trying to replicate city trends. He views all of this as a massive, cascading, society-wide competition in pointless display.
To fuel and maintain this massive system of display, you require an equally massive system of competitive selling. Schliemann turns his crosshairs on what he calls the sterile trades. He lists drummers, solicitors, bill posters, and he reserves a special venom for the entire profession of advertising.
He delivers a definition of advertising that is incredibly sharp. He calls it the science of persuading people to buy what they do not want.
I was absolutely floored by how contemporary this specific critique feels. If you listen to his description of advertising, the screaming egotism, the thousands of manipulative catch-penny devices designed to manufacture artificial desire, it sounds exactly like a modern critique of Instagram influencers, targeted algorithmic ads, and our culture of hyper-consumerism.
Yes, completely.
But he was observing the infancy of this industry over a century ago. And he points out that it isn't just annoying. This competitive drive to sell leads directly to massive fraud and physical danger.
He moves from the waste of persuasion to the deadly wastes of adulteration.
Yes. He explains that the desperate need to undercut competitors and maximize profit inevitably leads to manufacturing cheap goods specifically designed to deceive the ignorant consumer. He lists shoddy, disintegrating clothing. He lists unstable, dangerous tenements built with substandard materials.
He gives the horrifying example of ground cork life preservers, which is just a chilling image, manufacturing a safety device guaranteed to sink just to save a few pennies on materials.
He lists adulterated, watered-down milk, aniline soda water laced with toxic dyes, and potato flour sausages sold as pure meat. He calculates that this low knavery, this constant plotting, bribing, and cheating, costs society $1.25 billion a year in wasted materials.
More importantly, he notes that these adulterated goods send countless people to early graves, requiring the labor of doctors, nurses, and undertakers decades before their proper time, which is yet another layer of systemic waste.
To police all this artificial friction, he targets the entire machinery of civil law. He points to the ponderous tomes of legislation, the massive court systems, and the armies of lawyers studying tirelessly just to find loopholes to circumvent those laws. He categorizes all of this as a colossal waste of human intellect, made necessary only by the competitive balancing of petty profit and loss.
Okay, so Schliemann mathematically eliminates war, advertising, insurance, most of the legal profession, and the manufacturing of luxury goods. He clears the board.
But practically speaking, how does the text propose managing the economy without those mechanisms? I mean, how do you price a loaf of bread or distribute a ton of coal without a free market to sort out supply and demand?
Schliemann provides a highly mechanical arithmetic solution to replace the market. He calls it the Universal Government Bulletin.
Walk me through exactly how that functions.
In Schliemann's utopian vision, all capital, the factories, the fields, the mines, is the shared property of all citizens. Therefore, any injury or inefficiency in the system is felt by all, removing the incentive for individual sabotage.
Okay.
The economy is managed via a universal, transparent government credit account. Everything the Commonwealth produces and has for sale is listed comprehensively in a publicly available bulletin. Because no individual is extracting a private profit from these sales, there is zero stimulus for extravagance, zero incentive for cheating, and no reason to adulterate the goods.
And how is the price of an item determined if there is no market competition?
The price is determined strictly and exclusively by the amount of human labor it costs to make and deliver that specific item. It is reduced to basic arithmetic. He gives a clear example. If 1 million workers in the wheat fields work for 100 days, the total product is 1 billion bushels of wheat.
So it's a direct correlation.
Right. Therefore, the inherent value of a single bushel of wheat is exactly 1/10 of a farm labor day. If society arbitrarily sets the value of a farm labor day at $5, the bushel of wheat mathematically costs 50 cents. There's no markup, no middleman, no speculation.
But Maynard, the editor, raises the obvious practical objection to this. Not all jobs are equally hard or desirable.
Right, and Schliemann acknowledges that reality immediately. He agrees that you might easily find millions of people willing to be mail carriers, but perhaps nobody inherently wants to be a coal miner or a sewer worker.
Naturally.
So instead of using poverty to force people into those jobs, the centralized system continually varies either the wages or the hours to attract the exact needed number of voluntary workers. If they need more miners, they reduce a miner's required workday to perhaps 2 hours, while a mail carrier might work 4.
Which he argues is exactly what the current market attempts to do, but it does it blindly, clumsily, through rumors, strikes, starvation, and advertisements, whereas the Universal Bulletin does it instantly, transparently, and perfectly. He is essentially describing a massive, society-wide, centrally planned algorithm decades before computers existed.
Yes. And with all of these massive societal wastes eliminated and the workforce rationally distributed, Schliemann moves from the macroeconomy to the microeconomy. He transitions into describing the positive economies of cooperation, detailing how this revolution will transform daily domestic life.
This is where we plunge deep into his technological and domestic utopia, and significantly, he starts this transformation in the kitchen.
He focuses first on the liberation of what he calls the domestic drudge.
Schliemann runs the math on domestic chores. He calculates that across the nation, for 15 million families, the simple act of dishwashing alone requires the labor of 500,000 able-bodied persons, almost exclusively women working 10 grueling hours a day.
He doesn't romanticize domestic work. He calls it filthy, deadening, brutalizing labor that causes widespread anemia, physical ugliness, chronic ill temper, and in some cases, literal insanity due to the isolation and repetition.
So his proposed solution isn't just to share the chore. His solution is both technological and communal. He envisions a massive machine installed in each free community center that would collect, wash, and dry the dishes for the entire community scientifically.
It would sterilize them perfectly, saving 9/10 of the time currently wasted and completely eliminating the soul-crushing drudgery of the isolated housewife.
He applies the same scale of technological optimism to agriculture. He cites Peter Kropotkin's New Science of Agriculture, claiming that by utilizing scientifically made soils and intensive farming culture, a single gardener could theoretically raise 200 tons of vegetables on one single acre of land.
He grandly asserts that the entire population of the globe could be comfortably fed using only the arable soil currently cultivated within the borders of the United States.
He imagines a future where the erratic, rumor-driven food supply is systematized and rationally managed by armies of scientists.
Picture the sheer scale of the machinery he describes. He envisions a great potato planting machine, drawn silently by powerful electric motors, planting a score of acres in a single day.
He describes an electric potato digging machine that scoops up the earth and automatically drops the clean potatoes into waiting sacks. He imagines massive herds of cows milked entirely by electricity.
And when it comes time for the harvest, instead of relying on the haggard, sad-eyed, fiercely independent farmer scratching at the soil with primitive tools in isolation, he envisions millions of people arriving from the cities on special trains for communal summer holiday.
They arrive, do the exact mathematically necessary amount of work in the fresh air, and return home.
He draws a sharp contrast between the vibrant joy of communal, scientifically managed labor and the grim isolation, ignorance, and vulnerability of the small, independent farmer who is perpetually trapped and terrified by market competition.
There is a deep historical irony here that we have to point out. If you look at massive agricultural operations today, we actually have those giant electric potato diggers, and we have vast dairy farms where cows are milked by automated machinery. But those technological marvels were brought about by the intense drive of the very capitalist competitive system Schliemann so deeply despises, rather than by a universal government bulletin.
That's a fascinating point.
However, beyond that irony, I have a specific question about the meat industry. Because we were talking about The Jungle, a novel that is globally famous specifically for exposing the stomach-churning horrors of the Chicago slaughterhouses. Schliemann claims that no human being will voluntarily choose to work in a slaughterhouse wading in blood unless they are absolutely forced to by the threat of wage slavery and starvation. Is the text effectively arguing that true socialism inevitably, naturally results in a society-wide shift to vegetarianism?
Yes, that is the exact logical conclusion Schliemann reaches. And it's a point the beautiful young girl student in the parlor specifically asks him to clarify. Schliemann points out that it has already been scientifically proven that meat is biologically unnecessary as a food source, and it is undeniably less pleasant to produce than agricultural goods.
He argues that as long as society relies on wage slavery, it is incredibly easy to find desperate people willing to perform the most debasing, horrifying tasks just to survive.
But once labor is truly set free by the universal bulletin, the dynamics change completely. If citizens are not forced by hunger, the labor price for repulsive, traumatic work like slaughtering animals will naturally skyrocket.
The citizens, freed from trauma, will become more refined in their sensibilities.
Eventually, the labor cost required to produce slaughterhouse products will increase to such an extreme degree that those few who still stubbornly demand to eat meat will have to go out and perform the killing themselves.
And Schliemann strongly implies that the custom of eating meat would not survive for long if every consumer had to look the animal in the eye and personally slit its throat.
Exactly. So by eliminating the economic exploitation of the human worker, the system indirectly but inevitably leads to the emancipation of the animals as well.
That is a fascinating domino effect, and he finishes his grand utopian vision with a final sweeping point about public health.
He connects the political and economic corruption of capitalism directly to the prevalence of preventable diseases that are actively killing off half the population.
He argues passionately that under the current system, the vast majority of human beings are treated simply as disposable machines for creating wealth. They are penned up in filthy, unventilated tenement houses, stewing in their own misery and waste.
He says the fundamental conditions of their daily life make them ill far faster than all the doctors in the world could ever hope to heal them. These slums become massive centers of contagion that inevitably breed diseases which then spread outward, poisoning everyone, even eventually reaching the wealthy in their mansions.
So his final synthesizing thesis is that establishing the fundamental right to a dignified human existence, meaning ending the artificial scarcity, clearing the slums, and eliminating the filthy working conditions, will do infinitely more to advance human health and longevity than any future medical, chemical, or surgical discoveries science could ever possibly make.
He argues that disease is primarily an economic symptom, not a biological inevitability.
It is a breathtakingly sweeping, totalizing vision of a completely new world, Which brings us to the end of our diagnostic journey today. Let's take a moment to recap the incredible distance we have covered in mapping this awakening for you.
We started deep in the visceral, traumatizing, purely emotional awakening of chapter 29. We analyzed Jurgis sweating and screaming in a crowded hall, experiencing the agonizing depressurization and the raw spiritual rebirth required to recognize his own exploitation and the murder of his soul.
And we ended in the hyper-rational, mathematically plotted, techno-utopian parlor debate of chapter 31. We move from the tearing of vocal cords and the weeping of a wealthy woman to the scientific chewing of carbohydrates and the mathematical calculation of a 1-hour workday.
These two excerpts, when placed side by side, brilliantly capture the dual engines required of any major societal shift. You absolutely require the raw, undeniable, deeply emotional outrage at present conditions to shatter the inertia of despair.
But outrage alone is insufficient. You also desperately need the intricate, complex, sometimes deeply contradictory intellectual scaffolding to actually design, imagine, and build the mechanics of a new world.
And that dynamic leaves us with one final, deeply provocative thought for you to mull over. It's a subtle, almost unexamined detail tucked away at the very end of the text.
As the intense parlor group finally breaks up for the evening, the narrative perspective shifts quietly back to Jurgis. He observes the beautiful young girl student, the one who had asked Schliemann about the slaughterhouses. And Jurgis notices that she was sitting there, listening to Schliemann's cold mathematical theories with the exact same look on her face that Jurgis himself had worn when he first discovered the movement at the chaotic rally.
It is a perfect, silent mirror of Jurgis' own reaction to the wealthy woman's physical distress back in chapter 29.
Exactly. Why does Sinclair constantly frame the transmission of these massive, world-altering political ideas through the lens of silent, intensely physical observation of others? Think about it. Jurgis didn't hear the fiery orator first. He was awakened by seeing the strained cords in the wealthy woman's wrists.
And here in the parlor, he isn't just focused on Schliemann's complex economic math. He is struck by observing the physical manifestation of awakening on the young girl's face.
What does that structural choice suggest about how ideas actually take root in our minds? Is it really the brilliant logic or the soaring rhetoric we hear? Or is it the experience of witnessing the infectious, undeniable, physical passion of those who already believe?
It brings us right back to those muddy waters of human psychology we discussed at the very beginning. You cannot just take an X-ray of a society to fix it.
Because the transmission of revolutionary ideas isn't a clean, logical formula printed neatly on a page. It operates more like a contagion. It's passed silently through the quivering of a nostril, the white-knuckle clenching of a hand, or the sudden, terrifying look in someone's eye when they suddenly see the entire world differently. And once you catch it, the X-ray is never going to look the same again.